Blood did not just flow, it screamed as it hit the frozen earth. The world was ending in a chaotic symphony of shattering bone and tearing steel. Silence was a luxury long forgotten. The first sound of the morning was the snap of a human spine, a dry, brittle crack that echoed like a gunshot across the valley between Tours and Poitiers. It wasn't just a war, it was an execution of an era. A wall of shields stood against a tide of destiny, and in the middle of it all, a man who refused to die held the fate of a continent in his gore-stained hands. If the line broke, the world would burn, and every prayer ever whispered in the West would be silenced forever. You can hear the ghosts of the future screaming for mercy. But here, in the mud, mercy is a myth. The sky is turning black, but it isn't the clouds. It is the shadow of 1,000,000 arrows about to erase the sun. The date was 10th October, 732. The air was a razor, cutting deep into the lungs of the Frankish infantry. Charles, the mayor of the palace, stood at the heart of the phalanx, a mountain of muscle and iron. He did not wear a crown of gold, but a helmet of dented steel, scarred by 100 skirmishes. His eyes, cold and sharp as a winter's blade, never left the horizon. He knew that the Umayyad Caliphate was not just another raiding party. This was the unstoppable force of the Al-Andalus, a machine of conquest that had devoured the Visigoths and now hungered for the heart of Gaul. Before him, the hills were blanketed in white and green, the colors of the Caliphate. Thousands of Saracen horsemen, the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen, circled like vultures. Their war cries were a terrifying, rhythmic chant that vibrated in the chests of the Frankish levies. The ground itself seemed to tremble, not from an earthquake, but from the collective heartbeat of 50,000 men prepared to kill or be killed. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor-general, watched from his magnificent white stallion. He saw the Frankish army, a solid, immovable square of infantry, and felt a flicker of disdain. To him they were barbarians, in furs and heavy mail, static and slow. He believed the desert wind would always overcome the mountain stone. With a sharp command that sliced through the wind, he unleashed the first wave. 5,000 Berber riders, screaming Allah Akbar, spurred their horses into a full gallop. The sound was like 1,000 drums beating at once. The Frankish shield wall, a literal forest of oak and iron, braced for the impact. Charles moved through the ranks, his voice a low, guttural growl that kept his men anchored to the soil. "Stand! Do not breathe! Do not blink! If you fall, you fall forward." The impact was a cataclysm. Horses slammed into the shields with the force of falling boulders. The front rank of the Franks disappeared under a wave of white robes and flashing scimitars. But the wall did not break. The Franks fought with a savage, cold discipline that the Umayyads had never encountered. They didn't move. They simply hacked at everything that came within reach. Heavy scramasax blades sheared through horse legs and leather armor. The mud became a red soup, slippery and thick. Charles himself was in the thick of it. He didn't use a sword. He used a massive war axe that felt like an extension of his own rage. Every swing meant a life ended. He was a machine of destruction, a butcher in the middle of a slaughterhouse. He saw a young Frankish boy, no older than 16, get his shield split in two. Before the Saracen could deliver the death blow, Charles stepped in, his axe crushing the rider's chest plate like it was made of parchment. There was no glory here, only the brutal physics of survival. The air was so thick with the smell of iron and bowels that men were vomiting inside their helmets, yet they did not step back. The Umayyad cavalry pulled back, leaving a carpet of dead men and horses in front of the Frankish line. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. Abdul Rahman realized his mistake. This was not a battle of maneuver, it was a battle of attrition. He ordered his archers to step forward. A hail of arrows, numbering in the tens of thousands, rose into the air. They fell like a black curtain. The Franks huddled under their shields, the wood splintering under the constant barrage. Every few seconds, a scream would erupt as an arrow found a gap in the mail, piercing a neck or an eye. But as soon as a man fell, the man behind him stepped into the gap. The discipline was unnatural, almost demonic. They were a wall of stone that bled but did not crack. The Umayyads charged again. this time with their elite armored guard. The collision was even more violent than the first. Steel clashed against steel with a sound that could be heard miles away in the city of Tours. As the sun reached its zenith, the heat of the battle began to melt the resolve of both sides. The Frankish line was leaning, groaning under the weight of the constant assaults. Charles was covered in so much blood that his own men barely recognized him. He was no longer a man. He was a symbol of resistance. Suddenly, a frantic scout reached him, whispering news that turned his blood to ice. A massive contingent of Umayyad light horsemen had found a hidden path through the dense woods to the west. They were moving to strike the Frankish rear, aiming for the baggage train where the families and the supplies were kept. If they hit from behind, the shield wall would collapse in minutes. Charles looked at his tired, battered warriors and then at the shimmering line of the enemy. He realized that the trap was closing, and the only way out was through the heart of the storm. But as he prepared to pivot his forces, a deafening roar erupted from the Umayyad camp, a sound of pure, unadulterated chaos that shouldn't have been there. Something had gone wrong in the enemy's heart, and the secret of that scream would change everything. The air didn't just vibrate, it shattered. That scream from the Umayyad camp was not a war cry of victory, but the dissonant howl of an army realizing its heart was being cut out from within. Charles felt the shift in the atmosphere before he saw it. The relentless pressure on the front of his shield wall suddenly slackened. The fierce, rhythmic chanting of the Saracen warriors broke into frantic shouts of confusion. Something was happening behind the lines of the Caliphate. Something that Abdul Rahman had not planned for. But for the Franks, there was no time to celebrate. The sky was still raining iron, and the ground beneath their feet was a literal swamp of gore. 10,000 tons of horse and man were still pressing against their wooden barricade, and the wood was beginning to splinter. Charles raised his gore-drenched axe, his muscles screaming in protest, his breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. "Hold!" he bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip over the roar of the slaughter. "They are bleeding. If they bleed, they can die." Rumors spread through the Umayyad ranks like a wildfire in a dry forest. Word had reached the front lines that the Frankish scouts, or perhaps a rogue force of Aquitanians under Duke Eudo, had circled back and struck the Saracen baggage train. This was no ordinary supply line. In those tents lay the plunder of a dozen conquered cities: gold from Bordeaux, silver from the churches of Poitiers, jewels and silk. For the Berber cavalry, this loot was their lifeblood, their reward for years of desert warfare. The thought of their hard-earned spoils being reclaimed by infidel hands was a psychological blow more devastating than any spear thrust. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi saw his elite warriors faltering. He saw men turning their horses, not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate, greedy need to protect their gold. He screamed orders to stay the line, but the discipline of the Caliphate was dissolving into the chaos of a panicked mob. Charles saw the opportunity, but he also saw the trap. If he broke his defensive square to pursue them, his infantry would be slaughtered in the open field. He had to keep his men rooted to the earth while the enemy tore itself apart. He watched as the Umayyad center began to buckle, not from his own strikes, but from the internal pressure of thousands of men trying to retreat through their own advancing ranks. It was a meat grinder of their own making. Horses tripped over fallen comrades. Riders were trampled by their own brothers in arms. In the center of this madness, Abdul Rahman was a vision of fury. He drew his blade and cut down 2 of his own retreating soldiers in a futile attempt to restore order. His eyes met Charles's across a distance of 100 yards, a bridge of corpses separating the 2 titans. The Governor-General knew that if he didn't kill the hammer now, the conquest of Europe would end in this mud. With a roar that silenced the dying, Abdul Rahman gathered his personal guard, 1,000 of the most fanatical heavy cavalry in the world, and launched a desperate, suicidal charge directly at Charles. They ignored the flanks, they ignored the baggage train. They became a spearhead of pure vengeance aimed at the Frankish commander. The impact was like a mountain collapsing into the sea. The Frankish shield wall didn't just bend, it burst. For the first time that day, the Saracens were inside the square. The battle became a series of 1,000 individual duels. Charles was buried under a wave of steel. He swung his axe in a 360-degree arc, clearing a circle of death around him. But for every rider he felled, two more took their place. His armor was dented. His shield was a useless hunk of wood hanging by a strap, and a deep gash on his thigh was pumping crimson into his boot. He was drowning in an ocean of enemies, and his men were being pushed back, inch by bloody inch, just as the Frankish center was about to collapse under the weight of the elite guard. A new sound erupted from the tree line, the deep, resonant blast of a war horn. It wasn't Frankish. It was the sound of Duke Eudo's Aquitanian survivors, emerging like ghosts from the southern woods. They didn't hit the baggage train. They hit the rear of Abdul Rahman's charging guard. The hunters had become the hunted. The Umayyad cavalry was now squeezed between the immovable anvil of Charles's infantry and the unexpected hammer of the Aquitanian horsemen. The air grew thick with the metallic smell of fresh slaughter as the two forces collided. Men were being crushed to death by the sheer density of the crowd. The cohort of martyrs, as the Arab chronicles would later call them, found themselves trapped in a kill zone of their own greed and ambition. In the heart of the vortex, Charles saw Abdul Rahman. The governor-general was fighting like a demon, his white robe now a dark, sticky crimson. He was trying to rally his guard for one last breakout, his horse rearing over the piles of the slain. Charles knew that if the leader survived, the army would regroup by morning. This had to end now. He gathered his last ounce of strength, ignored the pain in his leg, and began to plow through the melee toward the enemy commander. Every step was a struggle through bodies and broken weapons. He wasn't a general anymore. He was a force of nature, a literal hammer destined to crush the crescent. But as he drew within striking distance, a group of Saracen archers, seeing their leader in danger, leveled their bows. A dozen strings snapped in unison. 12 shafts of death flew toward Charles's unprotected chest. Time seemed to freeze as the iron tips caught the light of the dying sun. The arrows didn't hit. In a split second of divine luck or sheer martial instinct, a dying Frankish sergeant collapsed into Charles, his falling body acting as a meat shield that intercepted the volley. The sergeant died instantly, 3 shafts buried in his spine, but Charles remained upright. He didn't stop to mourn. He stepped over the warm corpse, his eyes locked on Abdul Rahman. The governor-general's horse was screaming, its flank gashed by a spear, but the man remained a vision of terrifying elegance amidst the filth. He saw Charles coming, a mud-caked giant with an axe that looked heavy enough to split the earth. Abdul Rahman spurred his wounded mount forward, his scimitar singing as it cut the air. It was the moment that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. 2 worlds, 2 faiths, and 2 men collided in a spray of sparks and steel. The scimitar flashed like lightning, aiming for Charles's throat. The Frankish leader didn't flinch. He caught the blade on the steel head of his axe, the vibration rattling his teeth. With a roar that felt like it came from the bowels of the underworld, Charles countered with a horizontal swing. The axe head, weighing nearly 10 pounds of solid iron, smashed into the side of the Saracen horse. The animal's ribs shattered with a sickening crunch, and it went down in a heap, pinning Abdul Rahman's leg beneath its weight. The governor-general was trapped, his face pale but his eyes still burning with the fire of a conqueror. Around them, the elite guard tried to intervene, but the Frankish infantry had closed the gap, forming a tight circle of death. It was no longer a battle. It was a cage match in the mud. "You are in my house now," Charles growled, though he knew the man couldn't understand his tongue. He raised the hammer high above his head, but before the blow could fall, a surge of Saracen riders made a desperate suicidal break toward their fallen leader. 20 horsemen slammed into Charles at once, throwing him backward into a pile of shields. The sheer mass of the cavalry charge forced the Franks to retreat 5 paces. In the chaos, Abdul Rahman was dragged from beneath his horse by his loyal guards. He was bloodied. His leg was clearly broken, but he was back in the saddle of a fresh mount within seconds. He didn't retreat. He pointed his sword at the Frankish line and ordered a final, total assault. He knew the baggage train was lost. He knew his rear was being shredded, but he also knew that if he killed the Frankish leadership, the victory would still be his. The sky had turned a bruised purple as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The temperature plummeted, turning the sweat and blood on the soldiers' skin into a freezing crust. The third wave of the Umayyad assault was the most brutal yet. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a desperate, primal push. The Saracens threw everything they had left: spears, daggers, even their bare hands, at the shield wall. The line groaned. It began to curve inward, taking the shape of a crescent under the immense pressure. Men were being crushed to death by the weight of their own comrades. The air was so thick with the dust of the dry earth and the mist of blood that soldiers couldn't tell friend from foe. In the darkness, the only way to know who to kill was by the texture of the armor. If it was cold iron, you held it. If it was silk or leather, you struck. Charles fought like a man possessed, his axe now a blur of silver in the twilight. He was no longer giving orders. He was a one-man army. Every time a gap appeared in the line, he filled it with a pile of corpses. But even he could feel his strength fading. His lungs were burning, and the wound in his leg was making his movements sluggish. He looked to his left and saw his youngest nephew, a boy who had never seen a real war before, staring in horror at a Saracen warrior who had breached the shield wall. The Saracen raised a spiked mace to crush the boy's skull. Charles lunged, but he was too far. He threw his heavy axe, a desperate 1 in 1,000 shot. The weapon spun through the air, catching the Saracen in the chest and throwing him backward into the mud. But now Charles was unarmed. 3 Umayyad riders saw the opportunity and lowered their lances, charging at the defenseless commander. Death was 10 feet away. The lances were leveled. The horses were at a full gallop, and Charles stood with nothing but his bare, bloodied fists. He looked at the sky, perhaps expecting to see the gates of Valhalla or the face of God. But all he saw was a flash of white fire. A massive explosion of sound and light erupted from the direction of the Frankish baggage train. It wasn't magic. It was the final catastrophic collision of the Saracen retreat, hitting the main supply tents where the oil and spirit stores were kept. A pillar of fire rose 50 feet into the air, lighting the battlefield in a hellish orange glow. The horses of the charging lancers shied away, terrified by the sudden wall of flame. In that moment of distraction, Charles dived for a fallen spear. He rolled, came up on one knee, and drove the point through the neck of the lead horse. The beast collapsed, creating a barrier that stopped the other two. The fire changed everything. The Umayyad army, already demoralized by the loss of their loot and the death of their comrades in the rear, saw the flames and thought their entire camp had been incinerated. The panic was no longer a ripple, it was a tidal wave. Abdul Rahman tried to scream above the roar of the fire, trying to convince his men that the battle could still be won, but his voice was lost in the wind. His warriors were no longer listening to their general. They were listening to the primal instinct of survival. The retreat became a rout, but as the Saracens turned to flee, they realized the trap had fully closed. The Aquitanian cavalry had finished the baggage train and was now forming a line of steel behind the retreating Umayyads. They were boxed in between the hammer and the fire. And then, from the heart of the flame, a new shadow emerged, a force that neither side expected. The shadow that emerged from the wall of fire was not a demon, but a nightmare of flesh and iron. It was the Frankish reserve, 2,000 fresh, unbloodied heavy infantrymen who had been hidden in the valley, waiting for this exact moment of psychological collapse. They marched out of the orange haze like silhouettes from an ancient myth, their polished shields reflecting the inferno behind them. The sight was the final blow to the Umayyad spirit. To the exhausted Saracens, it looked as if the earth itself was vomiting forth a new army of giants. Panic, once a flickering flame, became a roaring sun. The legendary discipline of the Caliphate, which had conquered half the known world, vanished in the freezing night air. Every man became an island of fear, fighting only to escape the tightening circle of Frankish steel. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi stood his ground even as his world dissolved into ash. He was a man of the desert, a leader who had never known the sting of a total defeat. He screamed at his retreating officers, striking them with the flat of his blade, trying to turn the tide through sheer willpower. "Stand! The paradise of the brave lies under the shadow of the swords," he cried, but his voice was swallowed by the screams of 10,000 dying horses. He saw his army, the pride of the Umayyad Empire, shattering like glass against the immovable Frankish wall. He realized then that he wouldn't return to the palaces of Cordoba. He wouldn't see the orange groves of the south again. He turned his horse toward the center of the Frankish square, seeking the only thing left for a general without an army, a glorious death. Charles, now armed with a heavy broadsword taken from a fallen captain, saw the governor-general's suicidal charge. He stood at the front of his line, his boots sinking into the red mud that was now freezing into a slick, treacherous crust. The temperature had dropped below zero, and the moisture on the soldiers' faces was turning to ice. "Finish it!" Charles roared, his voice a primal sound that seemed to shake the very stars. He didn't wait for the impact. He stepped forward, meeting the charging cavalry head-on. The two commanders, the Hammer and the Star of the East, became the epicenter of a localized hurricane of violence. Abdul Rahman leaned low in his saddle, his scimitar whistling toward Charles's neck, but the Frank moved with the deceptive speed of a mountain lion. He ducked, the blade shearing a lock of his hair, and drove his shoulder into the horse's chest. The impact was bone-shattering. The horse recoiled, and in that split second, a dozen Frankish spears lunged from the darkness behind Charles. They didn't hit the horse, they hit the rider. 5 iron points pierced Abdul Rahman's silk and mail armor at once, through the chest, the thigh, and the throat. The governor-general was lifted out of his saddle, suspended in the air for a heartbeat like a broken puppet, before being slammed into the mud. He didn't scream. He died with his eyes open, staring at the cold, indifferent sky of Gaul. As the news of his death rippled through the ranks, the Umayyad resistance didn't just fade, it evaporated. The battle of the cohort of martyrs had reached its tipping point. The Saracens turned and fled into the darkness, abandoning their weapons, their armor, and their pride. But Charles was not a man of mercy. He knew that an enemy allowed to retreat is an enemy that returns with a larger sword. He raised his hand, signaling the Aquitanian cavalry to begin the pursuit. "Hunt them," he commanded. "Let no horse find its way back to the Pyrenees." The night became a long, agonizing slaughter. In the pitch black, lit only by the dying embers of the baggage train, the Frankish and Aquitanian horsemen rode down the fleeing Saracens. There were no battle lines anymore, only the sound of hooves on soft earth and the wet thud of blades meeting flesh. The woods, which had offered cover during the day, became a labyrinth of traps. Hundreds of Umayyad soldiers, drowned in the cold waters of the river Vienne, weighed down by their own heavy mail or the gold they refused to leave behind. By the time the moon reached its highest point, the battlefield was a graveyard of 20,000 souls. The silence that settled over the valley was heavy, unnatural, and absolute. Charles walked among the dead, his heavy breathing the only sound in the darkness. He stopped by the body of Abdul Rahman. He looked at the man who had almost ended the dream of a Christian Europe. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a grim, professional respect. He reached down and closed the governor-general's eyes. "You were the greatest of them," he whispered in the silence, "but the hammer does not break." He stood up, his body trembling from exhaustion and the onset of hypothermia. He looked toward the city of Tours, where the bells of the cathedral had begun to ring in a frantic, joyous peal. They thought the victory was over, but Charles knew better. As he stared into the southern darkness, he saw a series of new fires being lit on the distant hills. These weren't Frankish signals. The Umayyad reserve, a force of 8,000 fresh desert warriors who had been stationed a day's march away, was arriving. They had seen the flames of the baggage train and were moving with the speed of a sandstorm. Charles's men were broken, frozen, and out of arrows. They had won the battle, but they were about to lose the war. He turned to his exhausted lieutenants, his face a mask of iron determination. "They think we are finished," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "We will show them that the hammer can strike even in the dark." But as he began to reorganize his shattered lines, a terrifying sound rose from the earth. a low, rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a giant. The earth did not just shake, it breathed. That rhythmic thumping was the synchronized march of 8,000 fresh Umayyad warriors, the iron reserve that Abdul Rahman had kept as a final insurance policy. They arrived not as a panicked rabble, but as a wall of black steel, their torches cutting through the midnight fog like the eyes of 1,000 demons. Charles stood at the edge of the corpse-strewn field, his boots soaked in blood that had already begun to turn into a crimson slush. His men were ghosts. They stood huddled together, their fingers too frozen to grip their spear shafts, their eyes hollowed out by the sheer trauma of the day's slaughter. "Form the square!" Charles roared, but his voice was a rasping shadow of itself. The men moved like sleepwalkers, dragging their feet over the bodies of friends and foes alike. They were at the absolute limit of human endurance, and the real nightmare was only just beginning. The Umayyad reserve didn't charge with the reckless abandon of the morning. They had seen the fires. They knew their leader was dead. This was no longer about conquest. It was about holy vengeance. They moved in a slow, suffocating crawl, their long spears leveled, their shields locked. As they drew closer, the light of their torches revealed the true scale of the horror. The battlefield was a landscape of frozen meat. The silence was broken only by the crack of the ice forming on the armor of the dead. When the two lines finally touched, there was no grand explosion of sound. It was a wet, grinding collision. The Frankish line, exhausted and brittle, groaned under the pressure. Charles was at the very front, his broadsword notched and dull, hacking at the wall of shields with the desperation of a trapped animal. He felt a spear tip graze his ribs, the cold bite of the steel a jarring reminder of his mortality. "They are fresh! We are dead men!" a soldier screamed from behind Charles. The contagion of fear began to ripple through the Frankish ranks. The square was no longer a solid block. It was a shivering mass of men waiting to be butchered. In the darkness, the Saracens began to use a new tactic. They threw jars of naphtha, a primitive incendiary liquid, into the center of the Frankish formation. Small, intense fires erupted among the infantry, turning the square into a furnace of screaming men. The light of the flames showed the Saracens exactly where to strike. Charles saw his line starting to dissolve. Men were breaking rank, trying to crawl away into the darkness of the woods, only to be run down by the Umayyad light horsemen circling the perimeter. It was a slaughter in slow motion. The hammer was finally being crushed by the anvil of the desert. In the midst of this chaos, a shadow loomed over Charles. A massive Saracen captain, standing a head taller than any man on the field, swung a spiked flail that shattered Charles's remaining shield into 1,000 splinters. The force of the blow sent Charles spinning into the mud. He tried to rise, but his leg gave way, the wound from earlier reopening with a surge of hot agony. The captain raised his weapon for the killing blow, his face obscured by a veil of black silk. Charles looked up, the fires of the naphtha reflecting in his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt the cold breath of the abyss. But as the flail began its downward arc, a thunderous roar erupted from the high ridges above the valley. It wasn't a human sound. It was the collective scream of 1,000 mountain horns, ancient and primal. Down from the heights swept the wild men of the Ardennes and the rugged mountaineers of the Pyrenees borderlands. These were the irregulars, the scouts and hunters who had been lost in the fog for 2 days. They didn't march. They cascaded down the slopes like a landslide of fur and iron. They hit the Umayyad reserve from the high ground, throwing massive boulders and heavy throwing axes before charging into the melee with long-handled say-axes. The suddenness of the assault turned the night into a kaleidoscope of violence. The Saracen captain turned to face the new threat, and in that moment of distraction, Charles lunged upward, driving his broadsword through the gap in the man's throat guard. The captain fell like a felled oak, his blood steaming in the freezing air. Charles pulled himself up, using the dead man's spear as a crutch. "God is with the hammer," he screamed, his voice finding a new, supernatural strength. The intervention of the mountaineers turned the tide of the second battle, but the Umayyads were not broken yet. They retreated 100 paces and reorganized into a tight, defensive circle. They were now the ones trapped, but they were a cornered predator, twice as dangerous. The two armies stood in the flickering firelight, two groups of survivors staring at each other across a carpet of 30,000 dead. The air was so thick with the smell of burnt hair and roasted flesh that men had to wrap their faces in rags to breathe. Charles knew he couldn't survive another hour of this. He looked at his men, bleeding, scorched, and shaking, and then at the iron wall of the Saracens. He had to end this with a single, devastating stroke. He gathered his last 100 mounted knights, the Iron Hearts, and prepared for a final charge into the center of the Saracen circle. The charge was a suicide mission. They rode their starving, exhausted horses through the piles of the dead, the hooves slipping on the ice and gore. Charles led the way, his sword raised, a vision of the apocalypse itself. They slammed into the Saracen circle with the weight of destiny. Steel clashed with steel in a final, desperate symphony. Charles felt his horse go down, shot through with a dozen arrows. He hit the ground hard, his world spinning into darkness. As he struggled to regain his senses, he saw a figure standing over him in the shadows. It wasn't a soldier, it was a hooded figure holding a silver dagger, its blade reflecting the dying embers of the world. The figure leaned down, the scent of jasmine and blood filling Charles's nostrils. "The hammer falls," a soft feminine voice whispered in his ear. The dagger descended toward his heart, but as it did, a blinding light erupted from the city of Tours, turning the night into day and freezing every man on the field in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The blinding light was not a miracle, but the ultimate sacrifice of the city. To save the army, the monks of Tours had set fire to the great cathedral's outer wooden defenses, creating a massive, white-hot beacon that turned the valley into a stage of shadows. In that sudden artificial noon, the hooded assassin flinched. That heartbeat was all Charles needed. He didn't use a sword. He drove his armored gauntlet into the figure's throat and rolled away. The assassin, a high-born daughter of a fallen caliph seeking blood-feud vengeance, gasped for air, but the hammer did not look back. He rose from the mud, a specter of iron and ash. Around him, the Iron Hearts had penetrated the center of the Saracen circle. The second Umayyad army, blinded by the light and exhausted by the cold, finally began to break. The 10th of October was ending, but the slaughter would not cease until the sun rose. The retreat of the Umayyad reserve was a descent into a frozen hell. They fled toward the south, but the roads were blocked by the very wagons they had used to carry their plunder. The Frankish infantry, fueled by a terrifying religious fervor, chased them with the tenacity of wolves. Charles stood on a mound of the fallen, watching the destruction. He did not feel like a victor. He felt like a survivor of a shipwreck. His body was a map of scars, and his soul was heavy with the weight of 30,000 souls. The hammer was no longer just a nickname. It was the sound of his heart beating against his ribs, heavy, relentless, and cold. He ordered his men to stop the pursuit at the river's edge. "Let them carry the news," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Let them tell the South that the North belongs to the dead." As the gray dawn of 11th October broke over the landscape, the true cost of the battle was revealed. The fields of Poitiers and Tours were no longer green or brown. They were a dull, matted crimson. 12,000 Franks and over 25,000 Umayyads lay in the embrace of the frost. The river was choked with the bodies of men and horses, creating a macabre dam that turned the water red for miles downstream. Charles walked through the ruins of the Umayyad camp. He found chests of gold, piles of silk, and jeweled crosses stolen from 100 churches. But he didn't touch them. He walked until he reached the body of Abdul Rahman once more. The Governor-General's face was now a mask of ice. Charles took his own heavy wool cloak and covered the man. The war between the Crescent and the Cross would continue for centuries, but this chapter was closed in blood and ice. The bells of Tours began to ring again, but this time they were slow, solemn, and heavy. They were tolling for the martyrs of both sides. Charles's lieutenants approached him, their armor clattering in the silence. They knelt in the frozen mud, offering him a crown they had fashioned from the gold of the Saracen spoils. "The king is dead," Duke Eudo said, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "Long live the hammer! Long live the king of the Franks!" Charles looked at the crown and then at his blood-stained hands. He didn't take it. He picked up his battered war axe, the weapon that had earned him his name, and turned his back on the treasure. "I am no king," he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the remnants of the Caliphate were disappearing into the mists. "I am the wall, and the wall must be rebuilt." The victory at Tours changed the course of the world. The Umayyad expansion into Western Europe was halted forever. The border was set in the blood of the cohort of martyrs. Charles Martel, the man who refused a crown, became the architect of a new empire that would eventually give rise to Charlemagne and the foundation of modern Europe. But on that morning there was no glory, only the smell of wood smoke and the sound of spades hitting the frozen earth as the survivors began the impossible task of burying the dead. The hammer had struck its blow, and the resonance of that strike would echo through the halls of history for 1,000 years. The West had been saved, but the price was a scar that would never fully heal. Charles climbed onto a fresh horse, his movements stiff and pained. He looked at the city of Tours, the white stone of its walls now scorched and blackened. He knew the Saracens would return to the borders, and he knew the internal struggles for power would soon begin. But for one day he had held the line. He turned his horse north, toward the heart of the Frankish lands, leaving the graveyard of empires behind him. The battle of the cohort of martyrs was over, but the legend of the hammer had just been forged in the hottest fires of hell. As he rode away, a single snowflake fell on his cheek, a cold reminder that winter was coming, and with it, a new world born from the ashes of the old. The hammer had fallen, and the world would never be the same again.